Hey, hello, welcome to September and what I sincerely hope is my last anticipated video in front of this blank wall for the season. But as it's September and we're entering that kind of fall pub push that usually falls about September, October, though as discussed over the last couple of years, we've really seemed to amp up, at least in my anecdotal experience, the kind of pub push throughout the year. Like summer is as busy as the spring, is as busy as winter even now, so we just never get a break. But that being said, September is noticeably busy, and so today is going to be pretty busy. I'm going to try and keep it as succinct as possible, but get comfy. My foot is probably going to fall asleep a couple of times during this. Grab a drink, whatever you need to do if you want to hang out with me for the whole time, which I would of course appreciate. Usual caveat, I'm not going to get to everything, remember everything, see everything, so let me know what you're excited about, whether we talk about it today or not, which also segues into my ask that if you like these videos, if you find them valuable at all, if you just want to throw me a bone, go ahead and like the video. As many of you probably know, I'm awkward about asking for interaction up front, but will accept it. And with that being said, because we have probably over 35 titles, if I've counted correctly, we're just going to jump right into September 5th, which should be today if all goes according to plan. And the first title I have my eye on for the 5th is The Witching Tide by Margaret Meyer. This, I believe, is a debut and seems to be the perfect kind of transition into fall historical fiction because it is set in the 17th century, mid-17th century, in a coastal town in England and follows the witch hunts. I don't know why the witch hunts as a theme read as fall to me beyond the kind of correlation with Halloween, because you would think that kind of mob mentality, that kind of fervor, that kind of anger would align more closely with summer. But in that case, this is the perfect time because we're moving out of that kind of summer space into fall, and our protagonist is a healer and a midwife and a servant, and her world and the world of her town, her village, is turned upside down when a witch finder enters their community. And our protagonist Martha has been caught up in this witch hunt as she is being tasked with discovering devil's marks on her fellow community members, the women of her community. And so she's put in this position where it's basically, I would assume, her community and her peers versus her own survival. And this idea of the kind of mob mentality around these witch trials has always been one of the most fascinating and terrifying things for me around the witch hunts, whether it be, you know, my fascination with the Salem witch trials when I was younger, or how that has correlated to other kind of texts or books I've read about this happening in other places and other times. So I am very interested in how this is going to read, and I am especially interested in the central questions it's going to be exploring and how those may parallel our own times, because I think there are a lot of parallels there and a lot of opportunity to explore and make the historical relevant in that way. I am always a fan of historical fiction. Well, not always, we shouldn't speak in absolutes, but I really enjoy historical fiction, and I'm not saying that it has to be, you know, relevant to today to be written, but I think that those same kind of questions that we get in theater of why this play, why here, why now, are interesting in context of something like historical fiction. What ideas are we interested in exploring? What parts of history are we interested in illuminating? And how does the narrative of the past really play into the narrative of the present? So interested in this one and have babbled on probably a little too long. And then we have Herc by Phoenicia Rogerson, which is a retelling of Hercules. I know, big shocker. Obviously, we have seen a huge resurgence in Greek and Roman mythology retellings within the last like 5 years or so. I have lost all track of when Circe came out, but I believe that that was really the catalyst. Sure, Song of Achilles was popular before that, but from my own observation, which doesn't mean a whole lot, I feel like that text really revitalized a lot of our interest there, which I also think correlates to the Emily Wilson translation of the Odyssey, which put a pin in that for later, if you know, you know. But this is a retelling of Hercules, and something that I think has been especially interesting in these retellings that have been popular is it has been kind of interested in reclaiming these stories and reclaiming the stories of the women behind these myths that in many ways have been underexplored in comparison to their male counterparts, and also kind of interrogating and complicating the idea of a hero and and what that means, because a lot of the actions of these characters considered heroes might not be considered as heroic to readers today. And that is where I think this will be interesting, because it is a retelling, a reimagining of Hercules, to my understanding, that is told through the eyes of the people around him. There is, at least in the blurb, a little bit of irreverence to the tone of the blurb itself, so I will be interested to see if that translates into the actual text as well, because we have seen a variation, as there should be, in these retellings from our stories like Madeline Miller, which seem to, at least in the prose form, though of course not poetry or drama, though Madeline Miller, I believe I saw, does have a dramaturgical background, which makes complete sense to me, all the way to things like Katie Robert, who is retelling these myths through a romance and a spicier romance lens, which is also an interesting take on the source material and an interesting conversation with the source material. So I will be very interested to see where this falls and how it's approaching the text, and I am interested to see if it does carry a little bit of that humor into things and what that offers this story. And then we have One Blood by Deneen Milner, which is being comped as Homegoing meets The Mothers, which, yes, absolutely. It is really upsetting to me at this point to think about how long ago those two books came out, but they are two of the best books I've read in the last 10 years, absolutely. I absolutely also need to revisit both of those books because I loved them so much and haven't read them since they came out. So in the same kind of vein as those two books, this seems like it is going to be a kind of multi-generational look at a family from the Great Migration to potentially today. I know what some of you may be thinking. Melody, you say you don't like or don't gravitate toward intergenerational books. Why this one? I do gravitate to some intergenerational books. Where I feel like I have a kind of stopping point, or where I'm not as attracted to some intergenerational books, is that some, particularly like from the white perspective, feel a little too closely aligned with a type of theater I'm tired of, where we're just kind of like sitting around the kitchen table talking about our family problems in the same kind of way. Not that that makes those problems any less relevant or pertinent, it's just finding new ways to approach things. And I think also this kind of multi-generational look at the Black experience in America is really invaluable. I loved Homegoing, I loved The Mothers. I also, based on the blurb, am thinking about Liberty by Caitlin Greenidge, because in that book the exploration of the mother-daughter relationship was really deep and complex, and I really appreciated how that was handled and what that showed. So I think that there is the potential for all of that here, as well as the cover is just absolutely gorgeous. So long story short, just another example of me saying I potentially don't like something and then immediately being like, hey, look at this thing that I really am interested in that I said I don't like. So we'll see. I'll be very interested to hear the reviews on this. And apologies if I just started speaking at a very fast rate there. I really do try to keep it reined in. I don't always succeed. Then we have a book I will inevitably do on audio. Sure, I'll Join Your Cult by Maria Bamford. This is pretty self-explanatory. If you've been with me for a hot second, one, thank you, but two, you've probably seen me return again and again to this interest in this kind of cultish thinking and cultish language, and how our search for a community in the modern moment is a part of that. All of these questions, big kind of questions, are of interest to me, and this, written by a comedian that seemingly explores like her kind of forays into different groups in search of belonging and community that kind of teeter on the edge of cultish thinking, seems like it's really going to scratch that itch and explore those questions while still having a sense of humor about everything. And I love a sense of humor as well, believe it or not. So very interested in this one. I will probably use one of my hoarded Libro.fm credits if I can't get it through the library. And then we have Zadie Smith's anticipated new release, The Fraud. This is set in Victorian England and is following a seemingly infamous fraud case, and we are following two protagonists that are seemingly caught up in the spectacle of this case. So it is historical fiction. Very interested there. I am ashamed to say that I have not read nearly enough Zadie Smith. I did go back and look, and I have read Swing Time, but I could not tell you a single thing about that book. I believe I did it on audio when I was working a job where I was busting through a lot of audiobooks. That is not a statement to indicate how audiobooks stick in someone's memory or to be used as fodder for the argument that audiobooks are not reading, because I disagree agree with that statement, but that is just the fact of it. I don't remember the book, and there are lots of books I've read that I also don't remember. So need to go back, but I'm very interested in this one because it is about a fraud case, like I said, in Victorian England, where a lower class, I believe, butcher basically claimed he was heir or entitled to an estate. So it definitely feels like it's going to be playing with a lot of questions of class, and I'm very interested to see how Zadie Smith is going to draw out this world. Maybe fun unrelated bonus content. You are assuredly going to get to watch my hair fall in real time today, so welcome to my world. The next book I have on my radar for the 5th is The Spirit Bears Its Teeth by Andrew Joseph White. This is the author of the really well-received, reviewed, acclaimed Hell Followed With Us, though I admittedly did not get to my library loan on that one in time, so still need to read. But this is set in a kind of alternative, spiritualist Victorian England, but in a world where the veil between the living and the dead has thinned. Our protagonist Silas is refusing to enter this marriage because he is not a woman and refuses to become a wife, and so he is sent to a boarding school sanatorium type place. Dear Lord, those cicadas are loud. I apologize. They'll be in and out as they wish to be. But after Silas arrives at this school, the ghosts of missing students start reaching out for help. And then we have the first of admittedly a lot of witchy rom-coms for the month. This has really taken off as a romantic subgenre since 2021, or like revitalized as a subgenre, though we've discussed the differences in tone from when it was popular in the 2000s and whatnot. Regardless, Witches Get Stuff Done by Molly Harper follows our protagonist Riley as she inherits her aunt's house, her aunt's haunted house, but we follow Riley as she attempts to understand her magic, understand this new house and her ghost butler, as well as find a coven and sisterhood for support and community. Meanwhile, the head librarian Edison, and yes, the head librarian is why I'm interested here, has not had access to this house. He's like an expert on everything in this small town, but he has not previously had access to this house or the history of this house. So he sees Riley as an opportunity to fill his knowledge gap, and of course, presumably, sparks fly along the way. And speaking of sexy librarians, my romance book club in the upcoming months will be reading After Hours on Milagro Street by Angelina M. Lopez, who also has a book in that same series coming out on the 5th, Full Moon Over Freedom. And this follows a bruja and mother who has to return to her small town, her small hometown, to attempt to break a curse, all while trying to avoid her extensive extended family. Who she's not trying to avoid is Nikki, an artist who is in town for the weekend, and a former flame who seems like he may be the answer to her problems yet again. And then we have The Library of Shadows by Rachel Moore, in which Esty, our protagonist, is going to the 3rd most haunted boarding school in the country in an attempt to feel closer to her father, who was not a ghost. However, there are ghosts at this school, in this library. The libraries are magical in some ways. They have traps, they reconfigure, and the libraries have very likely ghosts like Mateo, who frame Esty for stealing a rare library book and then completely vanish, forcing Esty to go looking for him, and how their paths presumably cross from there. But of course the atmosphere, the kind of dark gothic library, dark academia kind of vibes here are a major draw, as well as Ghost Mateo. Listen, I am but an average millennial woman in her early 30s, just casually looking for the next Jessie in the Mediator series. So maybe this will fit the bill. And then we have The Art of Desire by Stacey Abrams, writing as Selena Montgomery. It's always kind of hard to navigate those pen names when they're no longer like secret and it's just like 2 people on the cover that are the same person, but this is a romantic thriller following a woman who has sworn off dating. So then, of course, as the maid of honor at a wedding, she is thrown in with this guy, Philip, who, after having spent 3 years in a terrorist organization, has a past that he needs to protect her from. So this is definitely romantic suspense. However, what really caught me in the blurb was a mention of an obelisk, specifically a mysterious obelisk and a lost kingdom. So while I admittedly do not know exactly what that is in reference to, it did make me think of the Arcane Society novels, which I have mentioned here a couple of times, which were also romantic suspense, but they all had a kind of supernatural bend to them. So I'm not saying there's any supernatural bend here because I do not know, but I will say I'm interested in finding out. And then finally for the 5th, we have Cities of Women by Kathleen B. Jones, which is a dual timeline narrative starting with a history professor in our contemporary timeline who is attempting to prove that an illustrator for a Christine de Pizan manuscript manuscript was a woman, Anastasia. Now, I don't know if we are supposed to know who that is, or if I'm supposed to know who that is within a cultural relevancy, a historical relevancy. So apologies if I am just not getting something there, but then we go back to the past and kind of build out this narrative for this woman, Anastasia, and see how these kind of timelines blend together. So I really do like this era of historical fiction. The dual timelines can work really well and be a great underscore, a great exploration, a great kind of modernization, and a way to kind of build tension between the dual timelines. Or it can feel a little forced in terms of kind of being didactic about the themes it's wanting to explore, particularly in the historical timeline and its relevancy for today. So we will see. Admittedly, most structures have pros and cons, but I'm interested to see what this is going to be, especially because I do think this type of historical fiction hasn't been as prevalent lately, or at least it hasn't been on my radar quite as much as it was even 5 years ago. So excited to see where we go with this one. And then would you believe it if I told you it was time for September 12th releases? I might not either. First release for the 12th is What Stalks Among Us by Sarah Hollowell. You have heard me talk about this book before. Sarah is a college friend, so I am not unbiased, but I do adore her work, her voice. I've been holding off on this one to read closer to pub day so that it's fresher when talking to everyone about it, but it follows two high school seniors and best friends who ditch their kind of class trip to an amusement park. Until I have read it and have been proven otherwise, am assuming Indiana Beach, because this is set in Indiana, and instead they venture into a corn maze off the back roads, because that's a great idea. Though in Indiana there could be a corn maze off any back roads, and that's not necessarily a red flag. What is a red flag is when they start seeing people in the maze, images of potentially dead people in the maze, images of potentially dead people in the maze that look just like them, and then they have to kind of find their way out of this maze of horrors. So I'm very excited to read and talk about this book. The plan as of now, which can always change, is to talk about it during a Feature Friday, and also hopefully to be able to talk about it with Sarah at some point in the near future as well. So if you have questions you want to ask, feel free to leave those below as well, and we will also revisit when we talk about this book more in depth, but so excited for this one. And then we have A Market of Dreams and Destiny by Trip Gailey, which follows a magical market under Covent Gardens, and our protagonist, Desi, has been sold basically to one of the biggest merchants at this market, and he sees his opportunity to gain his freedom amidst this market where first blushes or a month of honesty are up for sale when a runaway princess is eager to sell her royal destiny. However, this puts him up against guards out for her return and others who may be eager to gain her destiny for themselves, as well as potentially complicating his love with a young man named Owen, or Owain. I'm not sure, I haven't listened to it or read it yet. So this seems right up the alley for fans of Stephanie Garber, or those interested in kind of a more whimsical yet still dangerous take on kind of fae bargains. So we'll be very interested to see what kind of tone and atmosphere this one sets. Also makes me think of kind of a modernized Stardust in some ways, and I do love Stardust. So very interested to see what we're gonna get here. And then we have the highly anticipated The Vaster Wilds by Lauren Groff, which is her first book since Matrix. If you haven't watched my Feature Friday on Matrix, maybe go watch that if you're interested, because I thought that was a really engaging book that I thought people were going to be more eager to have conversations with me around than they were eager to have conversations with me around. So anyway, this is a return to historical fiction from Lauren Groff, which was new, at least I believe it was new, when Matrix came out. And this is following a colonial servant girl who escapes into the wilderness. And I am admittedly not someone who is usually compelled by man versus nature storylines. Again, I know the minute I say I'm not drawn to something is when I am drawn to something, and this is indicative of that, but I'm also not completely sure how much of this is going to be man versus wild. It definitely talks about in the blurb kind of exploring this point in American history at a hinge point, as it calls calls it in the blurb, which I found incredibly fascinating, and then also seems to be tying it back to now and like where we are in the current moment and how we can move forward, and if it's too late to change or to move forward. I'm not sure. It seems like it is going to be exploring some really vast ideas as indicated by the title. I don't know if it's going to be playing with the concept of manifest destiny and what that has meant historically, or if it's going to be, again, tying more into the current moment. Though I think the concept of manifest destiny could still tie into the current moment. I don't know if it's going to be very literal in terms of its historical moment. I don't know if being in the liminal space of the woods is going to give us more opportunity to play with that history and the structure there. There is just so much opportunity here. There is so much opportunity evidenced from Groff's prior work and where she may take her voice in this, and there is not much indication in the blurb into what exactly we're going to get or where exactly that is going to go. I think the structuring of Matrix and how she utilized language and structure to explore the ideas, the way those sentences were crafted, were so endlessly fascinating, and I think all of it was obviously in service of the story. So I'm very interested to see what we're going to get here. But this feels very far off from Fates and Furies in a really exciting way, because I think we've really seen a huge versatility in her voice from Fates and Furies to Florida to Matrix to whatever we're going to get here, and I'm very excited to see what form this is going to take. And then we have a book that has been out since the winter, I believe, in the UK, because it was through a HarperCollins imprint, and I definitely had my eyes on it with the strike going on, and that is Godkiller by Hannah Kaner. I have been so excited for this book. The cover is gorgeous, and it follows a young woman who has become quite literally a god killer after zealots for a particular fire god killed her entire family. But then she discovers a god she cannot kill and is soon on a quest with an errant knight. So I am so excited by the kind of concept of this, the potential scope of this. In some ways, I think it has me kind of reminiscent of voices like Lanny Taylor, and I am just incredibly, incredibly excited for this one. I have heard a lot of good things about it, so I'm anxious to read it for myself. And then we have Rouge by Mona Awad, most notably known for Bunny. This is being billed as a kind of horror-tinged gothic fairy tale, and this follows a young woman who, after the death of her mother, is invited into this kind of culty spa group that her mother was obsessed with, and our protagonist is also devoted to her skincare regimen and her videos about skincare, and it really seems like it's going to be zooming in into the culture of beauty in the current moment, but taking a kind of delightfully odd and horror-tinged view of this. I'm hopeful that this will explore a lot of the themes I was really interested in from Natural Beauty earlier this year that didn't necessarily get all the way there for me in that book, though I think it engaged in some really compelling conversations. But knowing Bunny, though admittedly I have not read last year's release yet, but I have read Bunny, and just how weird that was, I think this has the potential to be a really searing social commentary through that added layer of weird and kind of twisting everything just enough that it shows us how twisted our reality really is. So very interested in what this is going to illuminate, and hope it really accomplishes what I think it's setting out to do. And we'll of course judge it on what we actually think it's attempting to do in the moment, but excited nonetheless. Also, apologies, the cicadas have started again. It is what it is. Hopefully a nice, calming kind of white noise in the background and not the annoying screeching of demon bugs. And then staying in that vein of culty for a second, we have Black Sheep by Rachel Harrison, which the blurb calls irreverent horror, which I find really interesting. I have not yet read Harrison's other titles, which have been pretty buzzy, but this follows a young woman who has pulled away from her entire family. She's basically deconstructed from a cult, but then is invited back to this closed community for a wedding. And of course, through re-entering the space, pasts are illuminated and secrets are revealed. And I'm sure things get pretty twisted and the stakes get pretty high. And then we have The Witch of Wild Things by Raquel Vasquez Gilliland, which is a kind of Well, it doesn't feel full cozy, but it follows a woman who has been kind of fleeing the magical powers of her family and ends up returning back to her small town, returning to her job at this greenhouse or plant store, and using her power to talk to plants to investigate some unusual specimens nearby that aren't naturally native to the area, to my understanding of the blurb. But this also forces her to team up with a guy who broke her heart in high school, and these feelings blooming for an old flame are just further complicating her life as she is attempting to kind of root herself in her family and those relationships, especially as one of her sisters who keeps bringing her coffee is in fact a ghost. And so this is seemingly about a woman reclaiming her power, rekindling romance, and finding her place. It also definitely seems like it's going to have some aspects of magical realism, which I love, and while it definitely seems like it's going to be dealing with some heavier themes like death of a sibling, it also feels like it might teeter on the edge of cozy, but we will see where it ends up falling. Very excited to see what the voice and the feel of this is going to be. And then we have Dreambound by Dan Frey, which is about a father who goes searching for his missing daughter, and the only kind of clue he has to point him toward where she has gone points him toward her favorite fantasy novel and puts him on path with the author of the novel. However, it also reveals where the edges of this fantasy and reality are blurring. According to the blurb, it is told through excerpts of like journal entries, bits of this book, transcripts. So I'm very interested to see how the form serves the story and just how much of that fiction becoming real we get and how much we get to explore the fantasy world of this book, and if it's having a larger conversation about the escape to fantasy and kind of maybe mental health. I'm not sure. There is so much that could be done here and there's so much potential, and I'm just really interested to see how this is going to attack everything. And then moving more to the sci-fi side of the spectrum, we have The Death I Gave Him by MX Liu, which follows Hayden, who works in the same lab as his father, only to find his father murdered, the camera logs erased, and a recording from his father asking him to be avenged. So he takes the formula he had been working on with his father that has the potential to reverse death and basically attempts to locate his father's killer, only to be locked in the lab with 4 other people. And this is a sci-fi retelling of Hamlet. So very, very excited to see what we do here, especially because our cast has been kind of shrunk down even more. It feels like, based on the characters, and I could be completely wrong, that we are going to have Hamlet, of course, Claudius, of course, Ophelia, Polonius, and I believe the other person will be Horatio, but it could also be Laertes. I'm not 100% sure. I'm leaning toward Horatio, but I'm just very interested to see how this is attacked. And I think the idea of exploring this through the lens of a potential formula to reverse death is just really interesting. Since, you know, Hamlet spends so much of the time in the play pondering death, but I'm also interested to know what the kind of locked room, bottle episode of a sorts dynamic is going to bring to the table here. Just very interested by the whole concept of this. And then finally for the 12th, we have Salt Kiss by Sierra Simone. Now, I have not read any Sierra Simone, despite her work being incredibly popular, especially on places like Book Talk. It is, to my understanding, really veering more into the erotic side of romance, and this, to my understanding, is a spin-off of her incredibly popular New Camelot series, which again, I have not read. However, this is supposed to be a reimagined retelling of Tristan and Isolde, and I, again, like a good millennial woman in her early 30s, was fascinated by Tristan and Isolde when the movie came out way back when. Honestly, that movie was probably the most I've ever been interested in James Franco, but I am very interested in how the Tristan and Isolde story will be retold for a modern kind of romantic audience. And I've always been fascinated that we didn't get more Tristan and Isolde themed retellings around that time. But anyway, I've admittedly heard things both good and bad about Sierra Simone from readers, so I don't know if this will be the one to make me take the leap or not, but if you have thoughts, of course, leave them below. Whether you're encouraging me or dissuading me, either way, you're helping the TBR in some way. And moving on to September 19th, first off, we have The Land of Lost Things by John Connolly, which is the sequel to the Book of Lost Things, which came out quite a while ago. I read this in college in the back of a lecture hall. Don't worry, I was the TA, I wasn't ignoring a lecture. A friend had lent it to me to read, and I remember sitting in the back of that lecture hall finishing it and trying to hide how much I was crying. And that is some of my most vivid memories of it. So of course it's been a while, I don't have complete recollection of it, but I do remember for me at the time it being a really moving exploration, particularly of trauma and the ways that we can explore and mask some of that through the lens of fairy tales, but also the way that fairy tales are much darker than they're often given credit for, especially at the time that that book had come out. So very interested to see where we're picking up in this book, very interested to see if the first book still holds up within the modern context. I say mostly because my book club read another one of John Connolly's books a couple of years ago, I want to say now, and that one kind of surprised me in that I didn't enjoy it as much, and it did feel kind of dated. Some of the jokes felt kind of mean, didn't land as well. There was some fat phobia in it that I didn't really respond to, so I will just be very interested to see how this reads to me, but I almost think I need to revisit the Book of Lost Things before diving into this one. It does seem like it's more set in the same universe and that this should be able to be read as a standalone, but because I have at least some passing familiarity with that first book, I feel like I just need to refresh to really fully appreciate this. That's just me. I guess we'll see. We have A Study in Drowning by Ava Reed, which feels like it's going to be perfect for fans of Divine Rivals that are waiting for the sequel. It follows Effie, who according to the blurb is a girl that believes in fairy tales, who has clung very tightly to her favorite tale about a mortal girl who falls in love with the fairy king and then destroys him. And so when Effie's architecture college presents this contest to redesign the author's home, she jumps on it as her chance to figure out the secrets of this book. But when she ultimately arrives there, she finds a crumbling house that is a much bigger undertaking than initially anticipated, as well as Preston, a literature student who is going through this author's papers, essentially attempting to prove that they're a fraud. So this obviously sets the two of them up against each other as rivals, but there are of course forces bigger than either of them at play. And then we have Northwoods by Danielle Mason, which is taking a really unique look at structure for its storytelling. It follows a pair of young lovers who run away from a Puritan colony and build a home together, and then the novel proceeds to follow the lineage of this home, so the people that come in and out of the actual place. So I assume that the structure will feel a little bit more short story, just connected by the through line of this place, but I'm very interested to see how this concept is attacked, and I think that there is a lot of potential here. I'm just very interested to see what it grows into and what this home grows into. I assume is part of the narrative as well. I definitely, in my mind, have this linked with The Vaster Wilds by Lauren Groff that we just talked about as well, so we'll be very interested to see if these two are exploring similar things in much different ways, and if so, what themes are really at the heart of both of them, and if so, what about those themes seem pertinent enough in the modern moment to be kind of explored in both of these narratives. And then we have A Nobleman's Guide to Seducing a Scoundrel by KJ Charles. This is a historical romance about Rufus, who has unexpectedly become an earl, though this inheritance is being contested both by his greedy uncle and Luke, the son of a smuggler. However, while Rufus and Luke would seemingly be at odds with one another, and in some ways are, presumably, Luke is also a trained secretary and becomes an unexpected ally and eventual lover, though Luke also has a secret ulterior motive he is trying to keep hidden. I haven't read this book yet, though obviously I am interested. One of the reasons I am interested is because it reminds me, at least according to the blurb, of one of my favorite Cat Sebastian novels, The Lawrence Brown Affair, which I believe was her second novel that at least I read. So I'm hopeful that it gives me similar kind of feels, and if you liked this one and are looking for a follow-up read, definitely recommend The Lawrence Brown Affair. And then on the nonfiction side of things, we have Black AF, The Unwhitewashed History of America by Michael Harriot. This is pretty self-explanatory, but also in this moment, just reinforcing the idea that history is a much more complicated narrative than we have been taught. I mean, just think about how complicated the current moment we're sitting in is, and think about how every moment before us has been complicated in similar and different ways to the same degree and to the same level of nuance, and to recognize that our current version of history, as it kind of lives and is taught within the overarching zeitgeist, is very whitewashed. So I'm interested to see how this attacks that history. And then for an abrupt switch back to romance, because again, I am just gathering these titles as I come across them, and I did not sit down and do a more formal kind of organization today. We have Cleat Cute by Meryl Wilsner, which is a soccer romance. It follows the 10-year veteran and star of the US women's national soccer team who is forced out of the season early due to an injury. And during her healing process, she watches Phoebe, a newcomer, kind of coming in, gunning for her spot. But amidst this kind of on-field rivalry, they strike up a friends with benefits situation that quickly starts to involve feelings. So then they have to navigate their professional ambitions and where they fall on the roster with their romantic relationship. So this combines a sport romance with the perfect kind of setup for tension of all kinds and conflict, and I think that this is going to be really propulsive, and I'm really excited. And then we have another paranormal romance, Hex in the City by Kate Johnson, and this follows a witch who accidentally sells a famous magician a cursed pendant, and then they both have to deal with the fallout of this curse and the cleanup. I do remain somewhat reserved because the blurb mentions that our witch has Rapunzel-like magical hair, and I'm trying to understand or picture how that's going to work in this story. I assume it's going to, or presumably aims to, add levity and a little bit of quirkiness, but we'll see how that reads within the context of the book. I'm interested to see if it's going to work or if it's going to be just a little too much for me personally, but I guess we'll find out eventually. I can't promise when I'm gonna get to this one because, as you can see, there are a lot of books this month. And again, stressing that these lists are only aiming to be helpful in giving you kind of visibility, hopefully maybe, of what is coming out, not trying to add pressure and stress to your TBR or your reading life. And then we have Never Whistle at Night, an Indigenous dark fiction anthology, which is a collection of horror short fiction from Indigenous authors. And I am very, very excited. There are some huge names as contributors on this. And I'm also really excited to be introduced to new names and new authors from this. So I'm very excited for this one. I think that we have seen a lot of really, really strong horror out of Indigenous voices. So excited to continue to expand in my own knowledge base as a reader there. Okay, September 26th. We are in the home stretch. Are you ready? Well, even if you're not, you're gonna have to be because we have to get through this. The first book on my radar is The Scarlet Veil by Shelby Mahurin. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is the first book that we've had since the Serpent and Dove trilogy ended, and this is set in the same world following Sealy and the Chasseurs. Now, I do remain hopeful on this one, despite the fact that Gods and Monsters was one of the worst finales to a series I have read in recent memory. It was so frustrating in how little happened in that book or how little mattered in that book. So I am hopeful here that we can establish a continuation that catches the same spark and fire of Serpent and Dove and is able to sustain it through a trilogy, because it just didn't feel like that was initially intended to be a trilogy and how it was mapped out. I thought the second book actually did pretty well in terms of continuation, but the third book really just kind of face planted for me, and that could just be my opinion as always, but I still am intrigued by the world set up in those books and am interested enough in revisiting that world to see what we're going to get here. So hopeful on this one, but still somewhat reserved based on my experience with that last book. And then we have Kiss and Spell by Celestine Martin, which is the sequel to Witchful Thinking, which I finally bought a couple of weeks ago. I have not gotten to reading it yet, but it is, of course, as evidenced by how many are coming out this month, the perfect season for witchy reading. And this is yet another witchy romance featuring a witch trying to reclaim her magic, who makes a deal with a forlorn fae prince to help break a spell and help him find his true love. And of course, I am assuming feelings become a little bit more complicated on both sides along the way. I, having again not read the first one in this book, am really interested in the world creation here with the introduction of the fae. It's making me think of things like the Sookie Stackhouse books, where the world was expanded beyond maybe just like a magical town. So that piece of it just seems really fun and delicious, and I'm excited to see what we're gonna get with this one. But of course, I need to go back and read the first one first. before I can enjoy this one. And then staying in romance, but venturing back into historical romance with one of my favorite author discoveries of the last couple of years, The Duke Gets Desperate by Diana Quincy. This follows Anthony, who, upon his spendthrift father's death, is eager to inherit the title because he's eager to restore the family castle, only for when the will is read to learn that his father left the castle to his stepmother. So when Rhea eventually unexpectedly inherits her late cousin's estate, she is thrown in with Anthony, who is eager to reclaim his family's home and build it back up to its former glory. However, the estate is basically bankrupt at this point, forcing them to work together and presumably fall in love. And this does appear to be the start of a new series if you're someone that likes to read your historical romance in order, which I go back and forth on. Sometimes I can skip around, sometimes I want to read in order, but I personally feel like I need to read The Marquess Makes His Move, the third in the Clandestine Affairs series that I have been meaning to finish up before I read this one. Don't worry, I own it, I'm excited for it, and this is the perfect incentive to sweep back around and get that series tied up so I can start this one. And then there is This Dark Descent by Kaylin Josephson, which follows a mystical horse race, essentially, following a protagonist whose family raises enchanted horses, but their family is going bankrupt. And so she must enter this horse race to save her family, but there are literal life and death stakes attached to this race. And she ends up also falling in with an enchanter and a lord in the midst of a succession battle who kind of form an alliance of sorts. I am of course excited for the romance and the magic, but I'm also very intrigued because the blurb specifically mentions that this book is steeped in Jewish folklore, and I do love folklore. While I am not an expert by any means on Jewish folklore, I am eager to see what this pulls on and what other folklore I can dive into based on the inspiration for this book as well. So excited to see what this gives us, and regardless, feels like a win for all the horse girls out there. And then we have Land of Milk and Honey by C. Pam Sang, author of How Much of These Hills Are Gold, yet another book I currently own and have not yet read, which is why we have slowed down on buying books. But this is a dystopia, so again, proving exceptions to the rule all over the place all the time. But this follows a former celebrity chef in a dystopian world where food is not a commodity that can be indulged in the same way. Smog has spread, food is disappearing, and amidst all of this, our protagonist takes a job as a chef amidst this kind of commune retreat for the wealthy and elite, and really positions food and the indulgence of food and food as art as this kind of currency, and presumably looking at the extravagances and indulgences of the elite contrasted with what everyone else in the world is going through and how everyone presumably is starving if crops are failing. I do want to read this little bit at the end of the blurb because I think it's great. Land of Milk and Honey lays provocatively bare the ethics of seeking pleasure in a dying world. It is a daringly imaginative exploration of desire and deception, privilege and faith, and the roles we play to survive. Most of all, it is a love letter to food, to wild delight, and to the transformative power of a woman embracing her own appetite. So, very excited to see what this is going to be. It's been getting a lot of buzz in literary circles, and I anticipate it's going to be one of the buzzier literary releases of the fall. And speaking of buzzy, we have saved 3 of the buzziest books for last because presumably these are already on your radar. First, we have The Chalice of the Gods by Rick Riordan, which is the new Percy Jackson book, returning us to the original Percy Jackson crew. This is going to be nostalgic. It's presumably going to be epic. Very excited to see what we're going to get here. And then we have The Fragile Threads of Power by V.E. Schwab, returning us to the universe of A Darker Shade of Magic. I am so excited for this book. I've read the blurb, though I haven't really fully absorbed the blurb, I don't think, because I know I'm just gonna go in. And also it is kind of resettling us in these worlds, all 4 of the Londons, but also attempting to introduce us to new characters. And so it's the blending of both the old and the new. I definitely need to revisit and reread the Darker Shade of Magic trilogy. If you're interested in doing that together in some form, let me know. I'm a little disappointed because I had convinced myself that V.E. Schwab would be stopping in Chicago on this book tour based on like a teaser from a bookstore back after Indie Bookstore Day that I clearly misinterpreted, but I do have signed copies of the original 3 books, and did I cry when seeing the inscriptions of those books, including Ostravars? Absolutely, I did. So I am very excited for this, but I'm also somewhat trying to remove myself a little because I don't want to be disappointed. So I just don't know. But the Darker Shade of Magic trilogy is what introduced me to V.E. Schwab, and I know it's what really put her on the map in a lot of ways and really accelerated her career. And I just really love that series. So very, very excited for this one and also a little nervous. So we'll see what we get here. And believe it or not, we still have one book to talk about, and you're probably like, Melody, you've already mentioned the 2 biggest books of the month. What could you possibly have left to talk about? Remember earlier this video when I mentioned the Emily Wilson translation of the Odyssey? We are finally getting an Emily Wilson translation of the Iliad. I say finally. I own the Emily Wilson translation of the Odyssey. I have not yet read it. And having been a bookseller when that translation came out, it was huge. I have not seen people come in for new translations of classic texts like I saw people coming in for that translation, and it was huge for a reason, because it is the first time these texts have been translated by a woman, and that switch of perspective in the translations has illuminated new things. It's given new perspectives to these translations and to these interpretations, and has revitalized conversations around these texts. So with that being said, the translation of the Iliad is of course incredibly anticipated. And I'm especially eager to read what Wilson's translation brings to this text, which is considered one of the kind of cornerstone war texts, which has traditionally been kind of prescribed as a masculine space, though war impacts everyone. So I think we are going to continue to see a lot of buzz around this translation, and I think the renewed interest and the kind of exponential growth in Greek retellings, especially within the last however many years, only furthers interest in this. So I definitely anticipate this being one of the buzziest books, and being a book with real staying power, because I think we are going to be returning to these translations from both a kind of popular reading standpoint in terms of them being very accessible for modern audiences, but I think that they are also going to be utilized in classrooms. I mean, I can't say that definitively because I have been out of the classroom for a decade, but I assume that they are being used in classrooms or will be used in classrooms. So that is September. Believe it or not, that was probably pretty restrained, but let me know what you're thinking, what you're excited for, what I may not have mentioned, what you are hoping or thinking that fall reading is going to bring for you, but eager to hear your thoughts. Thank you, as always, for hanging out and listening to mine. I know that these videos can be a lot. They can be a lot to record, but I really, really appreciate you watching. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, as always. We've got plenty to choose from this year, don't we? But yeah,